back. Ancient River Valleys Part 2. So, those were some crazy ducks attacking John Wick, right? Alright. So, ancient river valleys became known as cradles of civilization. What that means is that's where civilizations began. Just like most humans after birth, they begin in a cradle. It's like a starting point. For World History 1, you need to know 6 total civilizations, the 4 older ones, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, and the 2 later important civilizations, the Phoenicians and the Hebrews. Okay, so now we're getting into what's likely the most difficult part of this unit. Not because it's hard, but because it's not as exciting as some of the other things that we're going to be discussing. For example, Battle Ducks versus John Wick. I mean, come on now. So anyway, we're going to be talking about the social, political, and economic development in these early civilizations. There's 2 key points for social development. First, when a pharaoh or a king dies and their son becomes the new king or pharaoh, that's a hereditary ruler. It's passed down within the family. A dynasty is when that same family remains in power for a long time. Kind of like your favorite sports team. If they keep winning championships, you refer to them as a dynasty. Okay, this next part is genuinely confusing for some people. So first we have to identify what is a rigid class system. Here today we talk about the upper class, the lower class, the middle class. But if I'm in the middle class and I buy a lottery ticket, I could be rich the next day. But in these ancient times, that wasn't the case. You were born into a class, whether it's rich, poor, in the middle possibly, and you're stuck there. There's nothing you can do to overcome that. Now, the second part that really confuses people is slavery. Slavery is an economic characteristic, but here it is as part of a social characteristic question. Why? Because it's not the main part of the sentence. They're talking about a rigid class system where slavery was accepted. That's not the main point. So please keep that in mind. So the political development or political characteristics are much simpler to understand because all it's dealing with is government. When you see political, you immediately think of government. So what is government? It's the rules that we live by, or the authority of people or persons that make those rules. For example, here in the United States, we have democracy. We vote for people who run the government. However, if you have a king, that king is the one who makes all the laws. So in ancient times, you have kingdoms, which are ruled by a king. You have empires ruled by emperors. You have city-states, which have some other type of leader, depending on which one it is. You don't need to know all that. You just need to know that's a form of government, which is a political characteristic or political development. So the second bullet says centralized government, often based on religious authority. So again, the king might say, I am in charge because God or the gods want me to be in charge. Now, in the case of Egypt, it's a little different. They have a pharaoh who is believed to be a living god. And finally, laws. Why do we need laws? Because if you don't have laws to hold people accountable, then everybody does their own thing. That definitely causes conflict. For example, if you think stealing is wrong, but your classmates think it's okay and they just steal your stuff, that's going to lead to trouble. So in early civilizations, they created these laws, and not everybody agreed with them, but that's just the way it is. If you want to live as part of a civilization, you give up some of your rights. The 2 main law codes that you need to know are the 10 Commandments, which obviously is from the Bible, and that's associated with Jews or the Hebrews. The other is the Code of Hammurabi, which is from Babylon, which was part of Mesopotamia. So we have a released SOL question now. This is talking about government. So the first thing I always do if it's not a graphic is I look at the 4 answer choices. We have religious authorities. Yeah, we've been talking about that. Elected officials, eventually we talk about it. Representative assemblies, we eventually talk about that. Tribal councils, not at all. So when you're talking about Egypt and Mesopotamia, which are early river valley civilizations, religious authority is the only answer that makes sense because elected officials, representative assemblies, they don't take place until later with Greece and Rome, and tribal councils we never have talked about and you won't talk about this entire year. We have another released SOL question. So with this one, the 4 answer choices are hereditary rule, limited population growth, social equality, limited economic growth. So hereditary rule we've definitely discussed. Father passes his rule down to his son when he dies. But limited population growth and limited economic growth we've not discussed. Social equality, that's something that we deal with today, but not in ancient times. So now we look at the question, which characteristic was most common in ancient river valley civilizations? Definitely hereditary rule. Remember, a king dies, his son becomes the king. A pharaoh dies, his son becomes the new pharaoh. So next we have the economic development or economic characteristics. Now this is a list of all of them, and if you'd like to pause at any time to take a look at these, you're welcome to, but I'm going to discuss them individually. So first up we have the use of metal, for example, bronze and iron, tools and weapons. So for example, iron tools, bronze tools. Why is that an economic trait? Because you do jobs with tools. Pretty simple. So this one gives people trouble. An increasing agricultural surplus, better tools, the plow and irrigation. What that means is an agricultural surplus. The word surplus just means you have more than what you actually need. So if you have more paper than you need and one of your classmates has more pencils, you could actually trade, right? Then you'd both have enough paper and pencils to get anything you needed to get done. So remember hunters and gatherers? When they ran out of food, they had to move along and find more food. But now when you have an agricultural surplus, you're saving food. You're putting it in wicker baskets and clay jars to save for later. And you're able to do that because you have better tools like the plow, and irrigation is when you're taking the water from the river and using it for your crops. So what ends up happening is they have more food than what they need. So what do? They trade with other civilizations. So when you have a surplus, you have more than what you need. So therefore you trade the extra. You definitely don't throw it away. I hope I don't have to spend too much time on this one, but it says increasing trade along rivers and by the sea. So again, you see the word trade, you know it's economic. Jobs, trade, money. So this next one is a little bit difficult. But the good news is I've really never seen too many SOL questions talking about development of the world's first cities associated with economic development. Now, obviously, there's economic things going on that it could be associated with, but that's a little ambiguous. It's not really giving you much information. So that's not something we're going to focus on. However, this last one does require a little bit of thought. So it says development of the practice of slavery within most cultures in the ancient world, taking various forms. Slavery is always an economic pattern or characteristic because, again, what is a slave doing? They're doing a job. They're not getting paid for it, but they are working. Now, where people get confused is they think that it's social because slaves are people. But remember, social is how people interact. Slaves are not interacting with other people. They're working, which is a job. So moving right along, this is a little more interesting. We're getting into religion in early civilizations. So the first thing that we have to understand is there's two basic types of religion. Polytheism. This is the belief in many different gods and goddesses, and it's practiced in most early civilizations because they didn't understand what was happening in nature. You had to have a god for lightning, there was a different god for the rain, a different god for tornadoes, etc. But then we have a second type of religion that comes along with the Hebrews. It's called monotheism. This is the belief in one God that's all-powerful. So the Hebrews are considered to be the first people that practice monotheism. But today, most of the religions that are everywhere that you see, for example, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all three of those are monotheism, where they're worshiping the same God. Now, one other point to bring under consideration is that the Mesopotamian religion influenced the Hebrew monotheism, but that influence decreased over time. This brings up an important point, the word influence. Influence is a recurring theme throughout world history. People, civilizations, etc. are influenced by who or what is close to them. So for example, why do your parents approve or disapprove of potential friends? If you're really close to someone who's not really good in your parents' eyes, your parents are afraid that you're going to pick up some of their bad habits, right? So when you think about who influenced the Hebrews, obviously the Mesopotamian civilization is the closest to the Hebrews based on geography. Later we're going to learn about how Japan is influenced by China because, again, their proximity to each other. And that brings us to Judaism. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the individual religions within each unit as we get to them because remember, they're back in the introduction videos, so you can always go back. But just to refresh you, I do have the notes up here. The main points are the Hebrews were the first to become monotheists, or the first ones to believe in one God. They made a covenant with God. The two big people that you need to know are Abraham. He's the founder. Remember in the introduction, I told you A is the first letter of the alphabet. Abraham, his name starts with A. He's the first Jewish guy, first Hebrew guy, first guy to believe in one God. But you also have Moses. He's also believed to be a prophet. Out of all of these characteristics for Judaism, the one that gives students the most trouble is the Torah. And we talked about this in the introduction, but it's the written records and beliefs of the Jews. When you read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it tells you the story of who the Hebrews are, who the Jews are, what they believe in. The 10 Commandments, it states their moral and religious conduct, meaning these are the rules they have to live by. And the last word there, covenant, Abraham entered into a covenant with God. That's just an agreement. So he made this covenant, this agreement with God, and that's what starts Judaism. And finally, Judaism spread by exile and diaspora. So the abbreviation is JEDI. Judaism spread by exile and diaspora. Exile is getting kicked out of your homeland. Diaspora is scattering. So again, we did talk about this during the introduction. Okay, next up we have another released SOL question. So we're going to take a look at the answer choices first. We have sacrifices. Nah, we haven't really talked about that. Ancestor worship. We will be and associated with the Chinese civilization. That's going to be coming up. Holy pilgrimages. We will be talking about that also in terms of with Islam. So monotheism. We've been talking about that quite a bit. So let's look at the question. The ancient Hebrews were the first to develop a religious tradition that included what? Obviously monotheism, because that's one of the key things you have to understand about the Hebrews is they are the first group of people to believe in one God. That's monotheism. All right, so next we entered the last section for this unit. I know you're thinking, thank goodness. Me too. So, remember we talked about in the very first video, talked about prehistoric times where there is no writing. Now we have written language. It's important. Language and writing were important cultural innovations because they facilitated the preservation and spread of knowledge. So we learn from people who write things down. Now, we still haven't gotten into historians yet. When we get into the ancient Greeks, they actually start this whole trend of writing things down so that future generations will know about it. That's history. We're still in prehistoric times. However, we do have writing that explains how things work, what they were keeping track of, etc. And we'll get into that. It's kind of interesting. So pictograms are the earliest written symbols, but crazy as it is, we still use them a lot today. For example, if you go into a bathroom at a restaurant, you'll notice on the door there's usually a symbol rather than saying men and women. The symbol makes it so even if you can't read, you know which each bathroom represents. So this is an example of cave art. If you look at that, it looks like a buffalo. Maybe it's not a buffalo, but you get the idea. We understand what it is. You can see what's happening. The picture on the right, maybe they're hunting. Maybe they're aliens. I doubt that, but you get the point. We're learning about what these people are doing because they're drawing pictures and showing us. That's what a pictogram is, but we do use them today. Once again, a handicap symbol in a parking space at a grocery store like Walmart, that definitely is an example of a pictogram. This one should be the easiest, but sometimes it's not. Some students really have a hard time with it, but hieroglyphics, it's a very odd word. I misspell it all the time. I hope that's not misspelled. I'll have to do this whole thing over. But anyway, hieroglyphics, the ones you're looking at are from Egypt, and these are a form of picture writing. They don't have an alphabet like the Phoenicians, although I do see a duck up there. But anyway, these pictures represent certain words, and they have to memorize them. And it's very complicated. But when you see this stylized form of writing, that's definitely Egyptian civilization. I would hope that's easy enough for most people to look at it and say, oh, that's Egyptian. You know, in hieroglyphics, look at the word. Again, you can pause it if you need to. Hieroglyphics goes with the Egyptian civilization. Cuneiform comes from the Sumerians, or Sumer. Now, this is confusing for some because Sumer is one of the cities within Mesopotamia. Now, if you look at the cuneiform, it's wedge shaped. What they did is they took a piece of clay and they had what's called a stylus. We use those on our iPads, right? So anyway, they push these symbols into the clay and then they bake it, let it get hard so that they can carry it around and preserve it. So we can now decipher these and read what they did. Most of the early cuneiform tablets were keeping track of what type of products they had that they were selling or inventories, things like that. But think about how lucky you are. You're here online instead of having to carry clay tablets around with you to school. So anyway, cuneiform from Sumer or the Sumerians, that is from Mesopotamia. Okay, so the Phoenicians are the most famous other than for their battle ducks, but they're most famous for their alphabet. So the word phonics is how you in kindergarten learn to sound out words. When you see C-A-T, you sound it out, k-k-a-t-t, cat. So each of those letters, they represent a sound. And when you put them together, that's phonics. That comes from the word Phoenicians. There used to be a really cheesy commercial where they would sell this reading product for parents that couldn't teach their kids how to read. And it would be hooked on phonics, worked for me. And we don't see that anymore. It's a shame because it was really bad. You would laugh at it. But again, if it helps you to remember, Phoenicians, phonics. Phonics is sounding things out. They created the alphabet. So we have an alphabet. Our alphabet did not come directly from the Phoenicians. The Greeks borrowed the Phoenician alphabet, then the Romans borrowed the Greek alphabet, and then we borrowed theirs, and it gets mixed up along the ways, but you get the point. So if it wasn't for the Phoenicians, you might have to learn thousands of different characters, and that would really suck. But because of the Phoenicians, you only have to learn 26 letters. So the next two are pretty new. They were just added the last couple years. So Sanskrit is the earliest form of writing from India. Now I'll be sure next unit I'm going to show you some video clips from Far Cry 4, which takes place in India. So you can see examples on those little wheels over to the side. That's what their writing looks like. So again, Sanskrit is from India, and these are pretty new, just added to the SOLs about 2 years ago. And also new, and the last one, is Oracle Bone Script from China. So you can see an example of the different type of characters that's a precursor to Chinese characters that we have today. Now, usually what's the giveaway is if you're going to see a picture of it, it's on bone. And anyway, it's relatively new. So it should not be something that gives you too much trouble. But again, this is the first type of writing in China.